Good morning. Welcome to our first session, which I realize is a bit early for a Saturday, but we're going to hit the ground running with some very engaging speakers and topics. So to my immediate left is Mr. Raymond Baker, who is the Director of Global Financial Integrity and a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, researching and writing on the linkages between corruption, money laundering, and poverty. His expertise is in corruption, money laundering, growth, and foreign policy issues, particularly as they concern developing and transitional economies and impact upon Western and foreign interests. He's advised developing country governments, and his extensive travels and dealings throughout Latin America have helped inform his expertise on corruption and tax evasion. Educated at Harvard Business School and the Georgia Institute of Technology, Mr. Baker is the author of The Biggest Loophole in the Free Market System, Illegal Flight Capital, Dangers for Global Stability, How Dirty Money Binds the Poor, and most recently, Capitalism's Achilles Heel, Dirty Money, and How to Renew the Free Market System. I know that this will be a very engaging speech, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Baker.
Thank you, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Is that too loud? Too loud? All right, okay. I'm delighted to be here with you to explore this, this fascinating agenda. I want to make a few economic observations and then delve into the philosophical underpinnings of capitalism, and then come back to offer some thoughts on how to remedy the kind of situation that we found ourselves in and avoid repeating this kind of crisis in the future. Let me say at the outset that I'm all for the capitalist system. I spent 35 years in international business before I segued into the think tank community, lived 15 years in Nigeria, then did business all over the rest of the developing world for another 20 years. So I believe in free trade, free currency convertibility, and free movement of capital. I do add a proviso to that, provided it's legal. It is the illegal characteristics of capitalism that have fascinated me for years. We in the West have created over the past half century an enormous shadow financial system of stunning proportions that moves cumulatively trillions of dollars around the world. This shadow financial system comprises a number of elements. Tax havens, of which there are more than 90 around the world, under pressure at the moment, but still functioning. Secrecy jurisdictions. These are places where you can establish entities behind nominees and trustees such that no one knows who really owns these businesses. These disguised corporations number in the millions around the world. Anonymous trust accounts are part of this structure. Fake foundations are part of this structure. Trade mispricing is the most commonly used element of this structure, and it shifts enormous amounts of money across borders. And then there are specialized money laundering techniques, and finally there are a lot of holes left in the laws of Western countries to facilitate the movement of money across borders and ultimately into our Western economies. For example, I suspect many of you would be surprised to know that it is legal to bring into the United States proceeds generated abroad from handling stolen property and counterfeiting and contraband and alien smuggling and slave trading and trafficking in women and environmental crimes and all forms of tax evading money and more. All of that can come legally into the United States. In our organization, Global Financial Integrity, we estimate that perhaps as much as $2 trillion a year of illicit money shifts across borders. And perhaps half of this passes through tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions somewhere between the beginning and the end of the transactions. Furthermore, we've made a very detailed estimate of how much money moves out of developing countries. We estimate that at some $850 billion to $1 trillion a year. This huge shift of resources moves through the shadow financial system and ultimately into our Western economies. This amount of money, $850 billion to perhaps $1 trillion a year or more, is 10 times the amount of foreign aid that we're putting into developing countries. And this amount of money moving out of developing countries constitutes the most damaging economic condition hurting the global poor. Two-thirds of that money is through commercial tax evasion. Approximately one-third is the criminal component, drug trading, racketeering, and so forth. And only 3% is the proceeds of corruption. We like to point to those corrupt countries over there, but in fact, by far the greater part of this problem is what we generate ourselves. Now, how did we get into this position? How did we get to the point of creating a global shadow financial system that moves so much illicit money across borders? To answer this, let's take a brief look into the philosophical underpinnings of capitalism. Let me first of all address briefly the question of greed. A lot of people say that this is just greed, and greed has been around a long time. It's not just greed. I have known lots of people, particularly bankers, who operated within this shadow financial system that I didn't think were greedy, and I don't think they thought they were greedy. On the contrary, they thought they were doing the right thing. The right thing is to take money out of places where it can be lost due to wastage or inefficiency or corruption and bring it to places where it can be safe and secure and can grow and can contribute to the global economy. How did we get to the point of thinking this is the right thing to do? We certainly did not learn this from Adam Smith. Adam Smith, of course, wrote Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, in which he laid out the free market principles that later became known as capitalism. But Adam Smith's primary interest and his first commitment was to moral philosophy. 17 years earlier, in 1759, he wrote a book entitled The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in this book, he lays out the character of people that he believes are needed to function effectively in communities and societies. He writes of the core characteristic of sympathy or fellow feeling operating across human affairs. He stresses compassion in suffering and empathy for the conditions of others. He speaks of the amiable virtues befitting people of character. Modesty, moderation, veracity, grace, prudence, probity, kindness, generosity, and more. These are the people who are upright, principled, conscientious, and trustworthy, people of sincerity and sympathy that he envisions will operate the free market system that he subsequently wrote about in Wealth of Nations. Throughout both of his books, Adam Smith operated for the interest of the poor over the rich, the weak over the strong, at every single juncture in both books where he had to make a decision as to what was of interest to one side or the other. Today's reality, with vast concentrations of income available to the rich, while billions of people live in poverty, is precisely the outcome that Adam Smith was trying to avoid. What happened? In the opening years of the Industrial Revolution, budding capitalists found far more compatible the ideas of a different gentleman, Jeremy Bentham, the principal proponent of utilitarianism. Bentham's idea is that society should concern itself with the greatest good for the greatest number. And he believes that maximizing the total advantages across the society is the way to go. Bentham approved selective sacrifice. According to Bentham, make sacrifice of a portion of the happiness of the few to the greater happiness of the rest. Subsequent utilitarians took this idea further and decided that ends justify means. Now, these were ideas that capitalists could embrace. Maximizing is of first importance. Selective sacrifice is acceptable. Ends justify means. Distribution is secondary. Distribution across the society is of secondary importance. It's the total advantages of the society that are important. Even human rights are subordinate to the goal of maximizing across the total society. Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism shriveled the influence of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. And from Bentham, there arose a capitalism-utilitarianism union that has now lasted for 200 years. And indeed, with maximizing widely accepted as the first responsibility of society, moral philosophy itself was largely sidelined for the next 175 years, until the 1970s. In 1971, John Rawls published a book entitled A Theory of Justice, and Rawls takes on the utilitarian notion that the first goal of society is maximizing, took that on frontally. In Rawls's words, each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. Justice does not allow that the sacrifices imposed on a few are outweighed by the larger sums of advantages enjoyed by many. The last 4 decades have been the most fertile period in history for theories of justice, theories that displace the priority of maximizing with the priority of justice. Now let me briefly take these ideas and move back into the economic realm. With the idea that maximizing is the first thing and the right thing to do, we inevitably focus on maximizing what we can see, the advantages to ourselves or our families or our companies or our countries. The commitment to maximizing outputs has pushed aside fair and legal transactions. The shadow financial system that I described earlier is, in fact, the embodiment of injustice. It is the legitimization of illegality in the name of maximizing. Bentham's flawed idea has contributed instead to the greatest good for a small number of people. With John Rawls and others, the capitalism-utilitarianism union that has prevailed is under attack. But the capitalists themselves have not noticed this. In this crisis, we have arrived at a moment where the interests of rich countries and poor countries are synonymous. The shadow financial system that harms the poor has come home to roost in our own richer countries. Part of what is so frightening about the current crisis that we're in is that we have no idea how big it is. We have no idea how much bad paper in the form of subprime mortgages and credit default swaps and derivatives contracts is hidden away in tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions, inside offshore banks operating without capital adequacy ratios, and inside hedge funds and derivatives funds that operate without accounting or filing or reporting requirements. The global shadow financial system which we have created prevents you from knowing to whom and for what purpose your money is being spent. Now, this is a bleak picture, but the solution is straightforward. The solution is transparency in the global financial system. We need to shine the bright light of day on these conditions in order to dispel the shadow financial system. What does this mean in practical terms? I will go briefly, just mention 5 priorities that have been adopted by an organization that Jack Blum and I are involved in. We can go further into this during the question and answer period if you want to. 1, automatically exchange tax information across borders. 2, know who are the owners of every entity that we're doing business with across borders. 3, adopt country-by-country reporting of sales and profits and taxes paid by multinational corporations and foundations. 4, curtail abusive transfer pricing in international trade. And 5, close the kind of loopholes that exist in anti-money laundering law, such that I talk about. Let me try to encapsulate what I'm saying. Greater transparency in the global financial system will operationalize the movement toward greater justice in global society. Greater economic transparency can provide the framework within which we can move toward greater justice in the society. The shadows cannot produce justice. Transparency can produce justice, and in my belief, it is toward greater justice that the capitalist system needs to move. Thank you.
We'll hold all the questions to the end, but our next speaker is Jack Blum, who's an attorney in Washington, D.C., and comes to this conference with, he just gave me an anecdote that his first investigation of subprime mortgages was in 1969, so a bit ahead of the curve on that one, I'd say. His career is focused on international financial issues with an expertise in money laundering, Patriot Act compliance, and international tax havens and evasion. In the 1980s, he worked for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This was simply one post in his 14 years of work on the Senate committee staff, most notably as a special advisor to the Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Terror, Narcotics, and International Operations under Senator Kerry, which investigated the BCCI banking scandal, which may be lost on some of the audience, but others I'm sure are familiar with, as well as UBS and Stanford cases. He regularly testifies to Congress and has commented on numerous television programs. He's also the chair of the Tax Justice Network, which you heard Mr. Baker mention, and the chair of the Violence Policy Center. He has a recent piece in the American Interest magazine, which some of you will be privy to after our conversations last night, in which he's interviewed. And he is doing UN work recently as the head chair on asset recovery, which I'm sure he'll speak to, and participating in the forthcoming 3rd conference of the UN on anti-corruption. So without further ado, Mr. Blum.
Thank you. Thank you. When I got this invitation, I thought it was time to step back and do some serious philosophical thinking about the mess we're in and how we got here. And when I say philosophical thinking, let me go back to my time with Heinrich Blücher and with Hannah, and what they taught me to do by way of thinking through a mess like this one. What you begin with is, what is going on? What is the belief system that has created the problem we're looking at? And is this belief system a kind of ideology that forecloses freedom, serious freedom? And if it is, we know that it's a very troubled problem, it's an ideology, and it's something we have to address. Now, they were experts in ideologies that destroyed careers and society because both their lives and careers were totally upended by Nazism, by communism. And both of them came to struggle with what it was that closed down freedom based on those ideologies. When you start thinking about what freedom has disappeared, it's really the ability of the political system to address any of the issues we're talking about. Everybody says, you know, why can't Congress solve these problems? Why can't we get a solution? Why is it that when we elect a new guy, he does exactly what the old guy would have done? And the answer, of course, is we have an ideology which nobody has really recognized as an ideology called the free market. Now, I'm here to tell you that I learned in 7 years of work with the Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee that the free market occurs very rarely in real life. We have monopolies, we have oligopolies, we have monopsonies, And when free markets turn up, more often than not, somebody wants to fix them. So, for example, you have farmers who get a price on wheat, and they're very unhappy because that price fluctuates, so they want subsidies to correct the fluctuations. You have sugar producers who want tariffs to keep the price from going down because there's competition from abroad. There's a whole range of real activity that prevents markets from working. Yet at the same time, with all of this knowledge of how limited really free markets are, people insist on free markets as a solution to every problem. Now, I would argue that that is an ideological approach which creates all kinds of problems that we're wrestling with, and we have to identify it and look at the problems and say, what are we going to do about it? Let me come back to how it's poisoned the political system. I was around when the Secretary of Treasury, Paulson, talked to a member of the Senate, members of the Senate. He brought together all the committee chairs, and he told them, unless you cough up X trillion dollars to support the banking system, it's midnight, we're over, it's done. And the senators were absolutely shocked. Shortly after that meeting, I talked to Senator Dorgan, who is a fairly important player in the Senate, and he said the meeting was absolutely stunning. We had no choice. We had to vote the money. This is the kind of political freedom that's destroyed by the ideology, because we have to support what the banking community has done. And of course, the risk is that if you vote no and you don't support it, and the system goes down, it's your fault. So you get trapped. Now let me talk about what happens when you accept that ideology and what's been destroyed by it. I'll start out with the proposition of law enforcement. If you have a completely free market, as Alan Greenspan believed, it's self-correcting, so that every player in it figures out, oh God, Bernie Madoff's a con man, and you don't invest with Bernie Madoff. You do your due diligence, and we really don't need police to figure out that Bernie Madoff is a crook, that he's hidden the money God knows where, or he has no money, that it's a Ponzi scheme. But we know that the market will correct that, and therefore we don't need a strong SEC, we don't need regulators, and least of all, do we need FBI agents who are going to ask whether a crime has been committed. So in this ideological approach, we shut down law enforcement. Now, I studied criminology with a man named Leon Rudzinowitz, who was the head of the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge, and his proposition was, when there are no cops, what you get is a crime wave, because the entire legal system of the West for something like 1,500 years has been built on deterrence. So here we had no cops, and the ideology saying, hey, it'll self-correct. But of course it couldn't self-correct because, after all, we had to support it at the end when the self-correction was in process. The second casualty of all of this is taxation, because who needs to collect taxes? The free market will produce all of those societal goods that are needed to keep us going. Somehow the free market will solve our problems of roads and highways and subways. It'll come about because there are private contractors, and they'll get money out of the public, but it's much better operated as a private tollway. Let's sell the New Jersey Turnpike. Let's privatize everything. The market will solve all of these problems. There's a fundamental difficulty here, particularly with respect to the third world, which is markets and the ability of people to have demand, which is an essential part of supply and demand in markets, is dependent on people having money. And most of the people who are in desperate need and need things built and done aren't part of the market system because they are broke. Dealing with poverty with this ideology is very, very difficult. Now, something else happened which is utterly astonishing, which is we allowed the privatization of the printing of money. Now, that hasn't happened since law, but by God, we're in it big time now, because what the banks discovered was that you could hoodwink the government by talking about free markets into allowing you to operate with almost no capital. The first discussion I had about this was with the General Counsel of Citibank in 1974, when he was arguing against 4% capital requirements. He said our bank doesn't need any capital at all. This is 1974, when the bank was reasonably solvent. Today it's a war to the government, and they have 1,000 lobbyists in Washington telling everybody it still doesn't need any capital. Now, why is that important? Because the constraint on the private printing of money are capital requirements and liquidity reserves and reserves that you have to keep for loan losses. And what's happened is that gradually, by moving the banking activity out of the reach of the regulatory sphere, the losses and all of these reserves are now no longer on the books of the bank, and anything the Fed does is kind of lost in the melee because they don't simply know what the banks are up to. I would argue what this led to was a creation of infinite amounts of credit, that you could borrow anything you wanted with nobody looking because no bank felt that it would lose anything because all of this stuff was going on through offshore subsidiaries and through arrangements which nobody could see, sieves, to give you an example, and Enron was a pioneer in that department. Once nobody is able to see what's going on, and why not just keep printing the money, which they did. So now we have the bizarre situation of real people in the real economy with declining incomes. Instead of money being used to creatively invest and produce, the money gets used to rip apart, destroy, and redistribute wealth up. So instead of taking a corporation, and let's go back to the movie which was talked about last night, Wall Street and Gordon Gekko, what is he doing? He's ripping apart a corporation to take its assets out of productive use. And this is the reverse of what you would think a capitalist system is supposed to be doing. Now, I'll give you one more issue, and that's climate change. Right now, instead of dealing with climate change, we're being sold the proposition that this can be taken care of through free market solutions. And of course, if you believe that, you haven't noticed any of the other things that happened with free market solutions. The real answer has to be taxation, and it has to be enforcement. The problem, of course, we confront in dealing with this is we are globalized, in fact. We have no globalization mechanisms that will allow for governance, and it's very difficult to solve problems without those mechanisms. What we do have is an IMF that enforces the proposition of free market. And this was the famous Washington Consensus. In other words, we're going to tell you that you in the third world can solve all of your problems by pushing forward the idea of free markets and dismantling your governments too. I'll make one quick final point, which is, in the end, we here in the United States have been forced to stand behind all of the crazy money that was created by this out-of-control banking system. We are now, our national debt has taken on the global mess. It moved from the bank's balance sheets, the bank's offshore balance sheets, to the balance sheets of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. And the question is, when are we going to wake up and restore the political realm and get back in the business of deciding our own fate and not leaving it to people who've discovered an ideology that permits them to do anything they want and move money to their pockets at the expense of other people and the society as a whole. Thank you.
I actually failed to mention the most important part of Jack Blum's bio, which is that he's a Bard graduate. Our next speaker is Zachary Karabell, who's the president of River Twice Research. It's a political and economic research firm, as well as serving as the senior advisor to the Business for Social Responsibility. Previously, he was a portfolio manager, chief marketing officer, and chief economist for the New York-based investment firm Fred Alger Management. Mr. Karabell was educated at Columbia, Oxford, and Harvard. In 2003, the World Economic Forum designated Zachary as a global leader for tomorrow. He sits on the board of the World Policy Institute and the New American Foundation, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of several books, including most recently, Superfusion, How China and America Became One Economy and While the World's Prosperous Depend on It.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a little unfair advantage and piggyback and disagree with some of what's been said so far by way of counterpoint. You know, it's interesting to try to look at the intellectual and ideological framework for the world we're living in, and quite valuable. And I certainly wouldn't disagree with the essential point that there's a free market ideology that took hold of a particular aspect of both American, Western, and to some degree global imagination that supposed some mythic beast called the free market that exists free-forming in nature, absent any organizational or societal or governmental action to create it. And there are certainly people who believe that very strongly, philosophically, ideologically. And there are many, many people in the financial system who act as if that's a verity and treat any government action as some sort of a contamination of this perfect entity called the free market, which anybody should know and should recognize is a complete myth. I mean, free markets don't exist separate from governments making them exist or trying to shape them to one degree or another. You know, that said, I really do disagree with some of the prior comments in that the presence of that ideology deeply rooted in very particular aspects of our society, including at various points in the past 20 or 30 years, more or less prominently within the government of the United States and more or less prominently within the government of Great Britain or the other countries in the world. That sits alongside of lots of other viewpoints. I mean, I don't believe that government enforcement ever went away. It waxes and wanes. Its budget goes up and goes down. And at the end of the day, Bernie Madoff was actually caught by the SEC, along with people who had spent 7 or 8 years whistleblowing. You know, I don't want to get too into the sort of inside baseball of it. I mean, one of the problems of enforcement in this country is that it's run by lawyers who are trying to chase accountants. And it's an unfair fight, you know, because when, you know, the accountants tend to win that fight because they can do things that the lawyers don't understand, and the enforcement people are often legally based as opposed to financially based. Some of that's been changing. I guess my larger point is I don't believe that free market ideology, while it's certainly an aggravating aspect and has a prominence, can fully explain or even primarily explain the world that we're currently living in and the problems that we currently have, any more than I happen to believe that Fox News is, you know, the sole source of disruption within the American polity as much as it is disruptive. We are at the tail end, and if we were here 20 years from now, we would be at the midpoint of a real transformation that's been going on in the kind of global economic system in many ways since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I do think is one of those historical before and after moments, which are rare, but not atypical for, you know, several thousand years of human history. So if you were to look at kind of highlights of the 20th century, you'd probably look at 1919, you'd look at 1945, and I think to some degree you'd look at 1989. And I say that because I think what went on then was, one, the world shifted from being driven primarily by ideas, which had been as much the motive force or the cutting edge of history for the past couple of hundred years, to being driven by capital. It's not to say that capital exists without an ideological framework behind it. It just means that business became much more of the dominating force once the clear ideological contest between these two systems ceased. And certainly the one that remained standing took that as a sign of ultimate vindication. But you had another factor in the 1990s, which was this efflorescence of technology. In the greater scheme of things, maybe not more efflorescent than the invention of the jet engine or the telegraph or any number of other epical innovations of the 19th and 20th century. But certainly the creation of the internet, the telecommunications revolution, which was much heralded at the time. There was that brief period of sort of mid-1990s euphoria / utopia where people really believed that the liberating power of technology was going to make wealth ubiquitous, poverty eradicated, disease no more, and everybody happy. And, it was the kind of time where someone could get up and say, I've got a dream and a plan and an idea. I have no income, I have no infrastructure, I have no idea what the product would look like, and, you'd walk out of the room with $50 million of investment capital. It was a heady time. But what's I think ironic about it is that many of the specifics, not the end of poverty and the end of disease, but the instantaneity of communications, the frictionless flow of ideas and capital, in many ways came true. It just came true much more destructively. That was a confluence of disruptive and destructive than people expected. Or maybe they should have expected it, but they didn't. And that one of the effects of those technologies was, in fact, to make capital flow much more rapidly than any government or any regulatory body or any legal system was able to catch up with. Business moved more quickly than government would be one way of looking at it. And in its mobility also developed a certain arrogance and was fueled, I think, by this ideology. But again, I'm saying I don't think it was caused by it. I simply think it was facilitated by it. And so we live in a world where you've got a sort of a 20th century set of governments and a 21st century set of business and capital. And it's an unfair fight. Whether it should even be a fight is another question. But insofar as they're two somewhat different forces societally, the advantage totally accrues toward the technology-enhanced flow of capital and business, and ideas about how business should be done, whether it's management frameworks, whether it's a global company like IBM, which everyone knows, but I don't think anyone really knows right now. I don't think anyone really understands what IBM is in the business of doing, which is really in allowing businesses to produce at lower costs with greater mobility of capital to markets that make sense and to divest their capital, labor, and interests in markets that don't make sense. And they are certainly one of the dominating drivers of that movement. The other irony in all this is that, the perspective on what's going on right now depends largely on where you are in the world. I would argue, and I'm sure this would generate a lot of disagreement, that what's gone on in the past year is neither the Great Recession nor nearly as dramatically bad as we currently think it is relative to lots of moments in the past 100 years throughout the world. Whether it's the Great Depression, whether it's even 1981, 82, but that what has happened symbolically is that a tipping point was reached that was happening anyway and was going to happen anyway. The collapse of the American model as it currently exists to be able to generate ever-rising prosperity commensurate with people's hopes, dreams, and needs was already happening 10 years ago. And lots of things got in the way of us noticing it, whether it was 9/11, whether it was the housing bubble. What happened because of the subprime crisis, which, by the way, was not the housing crisis alone wouldn't have caused what went on. What caused what went on, and then you articulated this quite well, was the shadow world of derivatives and money that was built upon subprime. If this had just been 4 million people losing their homes, many of whom were poor and not the motive force of the economy, that is not a value judgment. That's just a systemic observation. That alone would not have created the mess that we're currently talking about being in. That the technology enhancements that allowed those derivatives to be created and allowed them to be traded and allowed them to be disseminated throughout the entire global system was much like a computer virus. can infect an entire system very quickly. But that the systemic issues are a 20 to 25-year process, which is that the United States has ceased to be a manufacturing country that employs people. The United States remains a profoundly productive manufacturing company. We just don't need people to do it, just like we don't need farmers to farm. I mean, we need 2.5 million subsidized farmers, but they produce more food than 100 million farmers did in 1900. And that this trend has been in place for 20 years. And that a lot of the capital base of the United States, and to some degree of the European Union, although the EU has kept more of its capital internally because they've kept more of a safety net, has gone global. So what looks like a crisis for the United States has actually been this incredible boon for a lot of the world. It's been an incredible boon for China. It will prove to have been an incredible boon for India and for Brazil. There is a reason why you had this eerie, uncomfortable juxtaposition of images a couple of weeks ago where thousands of people gathered in Lincoln Park in Chicago are crestfallen, and thousands of people in Rio are elated at the choice of the Olympics. These things have a symbolic meaning, but they also point to something structural. I mean, granted, everybody's always dancing naked in Rio, but and it's always, Chicago's not the happiest place in the world under normal circumstances, but it does point to where the winds are blowing. And if you go to Shanghai, or if you go to Rio, or if you go to Mumbai, in spite of huge poverty and crime and corruption and decaying infrastructure in the India and Brazil case, in China, they have the infrastructure we think we ought to have. You're struck by the feeling of that these are societies that really believe that whatever system they have is on the ascendant, as opposed to our perspective that our system is mired in problems that we're unable to solve them, which I think is manifestly true. And that what is going on in a larger sense is less a crisis of global capitalism than a crisis of Western capitalism fused to Western notions of the place we ought to occupy in the world, combined with the inability of those dreams and hopes to enrich everybody commensurate with their desires to be so. The United States remains a highly affluent society, even if 50 million people are uninsured and 60 or 70 million people are underemployed and underpaid. In a relative to human history sense, where much of human history was generated by the need for food, clothing, and shelter, modern society isn't really figured out what to do kind of after that. Now, Europe has a little bit, although Europe is going to be tested by its own demographics in the coming years. And whether or not the European model will work when it's immigrant-fueled rather than demographically fueled, I don't know. I don't know. I think that what we're dealing with then is an inflection point in history that sees the locus of energy globally move elsewhere, much of which is a vindication for some of those, not free market ideals, but the ideals of the enrichment of people at an individual basis to a point is a very powerful formula that has very few competitors. And what I mean by that is the reason why the Chinese have become the world's great capitalists is that when you start very poor, where you hardly have food, clothing, and shelter, and you have a legacy of great societal disruption, a system that encourages the accumulation of material possessions to create a level of security and carves out a sphere of personal freedom, which is much more true in China now than it was 20 years ago. A sphere of personal freedom doesn't mean you have any ability to decide what's going on in the government. It just means that you have an ability to live your life more than you were before, is very powerful and has very few challengers. At some point, though, does that system continue to work? We are at very different points of that particular spectrum, the United States versus China, or versus India, or versus Brazil. And I don't believe that there are so many things to untie in the current knot that American society finds itself, that it's difficult, I think, to know what to do about that. And it is striking the degree to which other parts of the world have a visceral experience of both capitalism, and the future that was supposedly typical of the United States at the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th. So that the kinds of things that European visitors said about the United States when they came here, you know, the new republic hums with activity, everybody is focused on the world that they're going to create, blah, 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 blah. Combined with social justice movements that came on the heels of that, is much more typical of the world out there than it is typical of the world here today. And this may simply be an inevitability of history, you know, that societies have their moment of clarity and their moment of fruition, and then it's difficult, human nature being what it is, to maintain the purity of that, and then we all sort of fade into various forms of confusion and corruption. But I don't think the story is yet written on our own society. I just think we are at that point, and that it's important to distinguish between our own cultural confusion right now, which is deeply embedded in our own economic system, and the degree to which a lot of that economic system is not only working but flowering in lots of the other parts of the world, not in an identical fashion. You know, China has its own form of this that's very, very different than our own historical pathway, but echoes it and certainly copies selectively but intensively from it. So that's where I would put the current trajectory, that it is as much about the relative loss of position and the globalization of a system and its failure, it's reaching a certain natural end within the United States, as it has anything to do with what went on the past year. The past year was simply the proximate issue, and if we focus too much on it, I fear we will accelerate these trends rather than address them.
At a conference subtitled The Intellectual Origins of the Global Financial Crisis, it's somewhat ironic that we have one economist on a panel. But I assure you it's quality, not quantity in this case, and it wasn't by design that we have one economist, but by circumstance. Our next speaker is Sanjay Reddy, who is an associate professor of economics at the New School for Social Research in Manhattan. He received his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 2000, but I'm sure you won't hold that against him, considering that his previous degrees were in a Master's of Philosophy and Social Anthropology from Cambridge and an AB in Applied Mathematics and Physics from Harvard. He previously has taught economics at Columbia University and been a visiting fellow at Princeton University and Harvard. He's spoken widely in academic and non-academic fora worldwide and has served as an advisor and consultant for a wide range of international development institutions. He's published extensively in development economics, welfare economics, and the philosophy of economics, and served as a member of a number of journal editorial boards. And without further ado, Professor Reddy.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Taun. I want to say how much I've learned from my fellow panelists here this morning, whether or not they're academic economists. I think they're organic intellectuals in the broadly Gramscian sense, and great. There's really an enormous amount of insight that each of them has brought to this table. I think this is a very very rare sort of a forum, and we owe, I think, two kinds of credits, there are two sorts of sources behind this forum. One of them, of course, is that the financial crisis itself has made it possible to have a new kind of conversation across the trenches of different disciplines. I don't think it would have been possible to have this sort of a conversation 5 or 10 years ago. Even though I'm the only economist here, I'm assured by Roger and by others that that's because the other economists have accepted other invitations elsewhere to speak about the financial crisis, and I'm sure that that's true. There is an enormous interest in the world in understanding this crisis. It's brought economic issues back to the center of the debate, political philosophers, ethicists, and others, people, social anthropologists, as we saw yesterday, people in various academic disciplines, as well as ordinary citizens, crave answers to the question as to what exactly happened and how it is going to affect their own futures. And that's, of course, an entirely legitimate thing for them to ask. So we have a new level of interest in economic questions, and I think some skepticism about the previous answers provided. I think it's fair to say that economists in particular have been scrambling to provide answers, often in a rather ex post manner. Precious few of them, with some notable exceptions, such as Dimitri, who mentioned this yesterday, predicted anything like this particular event, and I think very few of them understood the microstructure of the financial markets, which was so central to the unfolding of these particular events. So there is a crisis of legitimacy of the field of economics, just as there is a crisis of legitimacy of the bankers and of the banking system and the shadow banking system. So that has created an opening to address all sorts of important questions. I think, nevertheless, we're at a very early stage of the dialogue. I think we saw this to some extent yesterday. There's a great deal of mutual education that has to take place in order to make the dialogue fruitful. I think Roger deserves a lot of credit for organizing this very ecumenical forum, and I'm quite sure that that reflects his own ecumenical characteristics as an individual. And that, of course, is the other proximate source of this event. How can we take advantage of this moment to reflect more deeply about the political and institutional arrangements which undergird the economy and how they can be reconfigured so as to be more conducive to justice as well as to other moral aims? I was very happy that Raymond Baker spoke so centrally of justice, which so often people, especially practical men and women, to use Keynes's phrase, do not, though, as he pointed out, they are more often than not slaves of some long-dead economists or philosophers. Let me approach this question by taking seriously the title of this panel, and then by taking seriously the title of the conference as a whole. The title of this panel is Global Capitalism the Root of the Financial Crisis? One could read that question in many different ways. One could, for example, emphasize the globality of capitalism, which is referred to in the question, or one could emphasize the concept of capitalism itself. Certainly, this crisis has significant global dimensions. I hesitate to suggest that it is more global than any other crisis which has preceded it, although that is possible. I wait for the labors of some economic historians to clarify whether or not that's the case. Certainly the Great Depression, for example, was a global crisis, not just a US crisis or a European crisis. There's some very interesting economic history that's been done, for example, on how poor people throughout the world in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia were badly affected by the Great Depression because of the manner in which it raised the real interest rates which they had to pay, and very often led to serious distress. So the peripheral economies of the world, as well as the metropolitan economies, as they're sometimes called, were involved in the Great Depression in a very substantial way. That crisis was, of course, a crisis which ramified outward very much from the metropolis to the peripheral regions to the extent that it affected them. This crisis also has that characteristic to some extent, or at least it looks superficially as if it very much was a crisis which began in the metropolis, the United States in particular, and ramified outward. But if one looks deeper and asks questions as to how the crisis originated on a longer time scale, that may be less obvious because of, for example, the importance of the global financial flows, which Raymond again pointed to, many of which are south to north financial flows, flows from the poor countries or the poorer countries to the richer countries, which may have had a causal role to play in the crisis as well in making possible the era of cheap money, which was very much the backdrop for the crisis that emerged. I don't want to focus on the question of whether or not the process of globalization was central to the causal emergence of this crisis beyond these brief comments, but it's certainly something that we could return to in our discussion. Let me focus instead much more centrally on the question of whether capitalism is the root of the financial crisis. I think the most fruitful way to approach this might be to note that manias, crashes, and panics, to use the memorable phrase of Charles Kindleberger, are endemic in market systems. One can find historical examples of such manias, crashes, and panics going back a very long time indeed. And there are very deep reasons why they are endemic to market systems, which have to do with the fact that financial assets have indeterminate valuations which are influenced by expectations of the future, which in turn are greatly influenced by psychology of market participants. There are various positive feedback mechanisms rather than the negative feedback mechanisms which usually dampen down deviations from equilibrium or fundamental prices, which are experienced in financial markets, at least over the short to intermediate term. And these can generate what are called bubbles. I don't want to go into all of the mathematical jargon that could be involved in such a discussion, but suffice it to say that there are various ways in which one can describe financial markets which place these kind of dynamics in which bubbles emerge very much at the center. Usually, in mainstream economics, bubbles are wished away. Those of you who are familiar with the mathematical term called the transversality condition will know that this is something which is usually imposed in macroeconomic models of the standard type, which simply wishes away the occurrence of bubbles. In fact, we know that bubbles emerge, and the central economic reason why they emerge is that it is entirely rational to hold a financial asset which one does not believe has a fundamental valuation if one believes that one can pass it on to somebody else at a higher price. It's as simple as that. As long as there are suckers, then there's the possibility of bubbles, and indeed rational bubbles. Now, the transversality condition simply says you can't do that forever. There's some point at which you can't find a sucker. Well, as long as that point is not yet, then it's perfectly rational to participate in the bubble. The trouble, of course, is that one doesn't want to be left holding the bag as an individual. So there can be systematic overshooting of the fundamentals or of equilibrium in financial markets, and we see it all the time. What is to separate this crisis from the garden variety, as it were, manias, crashes, and panics? And in calling them garden variety, manias, crashes, and panics, I'm not saying that they're not important or that they can't have tremendously disruptive effects on economies. Take, for example, the Japanese real estate bubble of the late 1980s, which, when it collapsed, seemed to propel Japan into a deep depression from which it has not yet emerged. Although that was a bubble with enormous macroeconomic consequences, I would say that it was a garden variety bubble in the sense that at any one moment in time, the value of the underlying asset, a square foot of Tokyo real estate, was known by all of the market participants. Just as hundreds of years earlier, the price of tulips was known by all of the participants in the infamous historical bubble in which tulip bulbs were overvalued. So at any one moment in time, the market participants knew the value of the asset, which is to say they knew the market price at which it traded. And at a certain point in time, it was trading at a very high market price, and then at another point in time, perhaps the very next moment, the bubble had burst and it was trading at a very low market price. But the price itself was transparent to all of the participants, and the object was well defined. So whether it's swampland in Florida, or tulip bulbs, or Tokyo real estate, or something else, the garden variety bubble centers on a financial asset, the value of which is overbid, but which is known at any one moment in time, before and after the bubble bursts. It seems to me that one crucial difference between those garden variety crises and the present crisis has been that the present crisis, much more than the earlier crises, and I don't want to claim that the division is as stark as night and day, but much more than the previous crises, has also involved a deep epistemic difficulty. This should please the humanities scholars among us. There is an epistemic crisis at the heart of the financial crisis, and it's very important, I think, to understand that. It's been alluded to by various people, including by Raymond Baker earlier. The values of the financial assets which are being traded in the present crisis, or not traded as the case may be, but which were held by the financial institutions and individuals who are most affected, are to a considerable extent unknown. And it is because of the uncertainty about the appropriate values to ascribe, or about the market valuations which would emerge if these assets were actually observed to be traded, which they're not, that there has been considerable confusion on the part of the market participants, which has caused, to a considerable extent, the dynamics of the crisis as we have observed them. It is really a remarkable thing that major financial institutions with enormous sophistication and very deep pockets with which to hire the best available experts are not able, or have not been able at any moment in time, to determine what their net assets and liabilities are. And this despite considerable work on accounting conventions which preceded this episode. So the crisis has made bare that accounting involves conventions, that it's not merely a science, that those conventions can be debated, that those conventions are based on underlying theories as to how the world works, and that those theories can be upended, in which case rampant confusion can be sown among all concerned. And because there can be, as a result, such uncertainty, such deep uncertainty about the values to be attached to the assets which are being held and which could potentially be traded, trade itself might stop. Now, as I suggested yesterday in a comment I made, this is not to say that the concept of price of such an asset is meaningless, but it's just to say that markets can go missing temporarily as a result of these kinds of uncertainties. And the problems in valuation can lead to various knock-on effects. I think this is a qualitatively different feature of the current crisis, though the current crisis has features of traditional manias, crashes, and panics, needless to say, as well. From this standpoint, I would say that advanced financial capitalism is at the root of this crisis. The advanced financial capitalism in particular, which has emerged over the last 25 years of financial innovation, rather than capitalism as such. Let me now attempt to take seriously the title of the conference of the whole, as a whole, the intellectual origins of the global financial crisis. What are the intellectual origins of the global financial crisis? Well, it seems to me that in intellectual history, it's quite common to think about the relationship between previous ideas and current ideas, to explore the relationship between ideas and ideas. But what's being asked for here is to explore the relationship between ideas and events or occurrences in the world. How is the relation between ideas and facts in the world manifested? Well, of course, very much through the individual actors who possess those ideas. Who were those actors in this case, and what were the ideas they possessed which led to the relevant transmission? Well, economists and the world which they spawned were very much at the center of this process. As many of you know, the complex financial derivatives which were developed and which were the basis of the various kinds of toxic assets, now toxic assets, which have been at the center of this crisis, were developed by practical men and women, again to use Keynes's phrase, but also very much supported by an economic theory. Very often, the work of financial economists in the 1960s and 70s is pointed to as the origin of these developments, people like Black and Scholes and Miller and so on. But I think that there's a deeper origin still. There's a concept which Kenneth Arrow and Gérard Debreu put at the very center of modern economic theory, which is that of complete contingent claims markets. Their idea of a market utopia was a world in which it would be possible to write contracts involving possible states of the world which could arise and the transactions which would be made or should be made in the event that any one of those possible states of the world arose. So these contracts would be contracts which could be written today, which would specify what each of us would owe one another if one of many possible things would happen tomorrow. Now, derivatives contracts are precisely such Arrow-Debreu securities, as they're called. Arrow and Debreu argued that in a world of complete contingent claims markets, there would be Pareto optimality, the heaven of economists, and of course their conclusion rested on certain premises about the rationality of the agents and their ability to foresee the future and so on. So if one wanted to lay the blame, I think one could lay the blame in part on the shoulders of Arrow and Debreu. I remember personally in graduate school talking to a then PhD student at the Harvard Business School, who is now a tenured professor at Harvard Business School, who was previously a banker at Credit Suisse First Boston. And I had been reading some of the work of people like Randall Dodd, one of the unsung heroes of this debate, who from the early 1990s had been pointing out the possible dangers to systemic stability of derivatives. And Randall Dodd and others were viewed as kooks who understood very little economics by all of those concerned. And indeed, my friend informed me that I understood very little economics, obviously, and certainly I had no idea what derivatives were if I thought that they could generate systemic instability, that it was immediately obvious by definition that a derivative was a risk-reducing instrument and could not be a risk-increasing one. I'm sorry to say that that point of view was not unique. It was, in fact, the dogma of the time among academic economists and certainly among financial economists, with some very, very rare exceptions. Even people like Robert Shiller, who has recently written a book on irrational exuberance, co-authored such a book, and is associated with the view that there can be manias, crashes, and panics in financial markets, I would say, by and large, took the position that those manias, crashes, and panics were endemic to all financial markets, but did not specifically recognize the role of derivatives in generating systemic instability. So economics was very much at the center of the creation of this world. It's a very interesting case of ideas influencing the world, even though, of course, there were many other factors involved too, such as the development of information technology, the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system and the flow of funds that made possible, and so on and so forth. And clearly there are other ideas involved too, political ideas, about the degree of deference which should be given to technocrats, whether private sector or public sector technocrats, which continue to plague us in different ways. And so I think this conference has a very important role to play in helping us better to understand what should be the appropriate relation between political ideas, political sovereignty, political community, democracy, and economic outcomes, and what is the degree of deference which should be given to technocratic expertise in that process, how technocratic expertise can be better brought to heel or integrated with other kinds of knowledge and values, which is a discussion which has unfortunately been largely avoided in the last 25 to 30 years. I think it's the first stage in a long and difficult dialogue, but one which will have to take place and promises to be very worthwhile. Thank you.
questions for this panel, but I'm going to abuse my position as moderator to ask the first one. And Professor Reddy touched on manias, panics, and crashes, and bubbles being, financial crisis being an inherent part of capitalism. And any good reader of Hyman Minsky will extract that those crashes come directly after or shortly after the relaxation of regulation in times of euphoria. Raymond Baker and Jack Blum spoke well to what might be done to reinstate a handle on such regulation, or what issues need to be addressed. But my question is largely directed to Zachary on the issue of, you seem to allude that regulation inherently trails innovation. The so-called calculation, or the magic that's attached to the calculation that Professor Potterai spoke of last night. And I think a lot of people would be sympathetic to this view, especially from the business world. So, I mean, what do you see as solutions, or if there even are solutions, to addressing these magical or mystifying products, such as not just Ponzi schemes, or derivatives, but structured products?
I mean, Raymond said one thing that, and this is not going to be a hopeful answer, but that the lack of global institutions, and insofar as I actually do see this as a global phenomenon, whether you could say it's globalization that caused it, that I think ascribes some sort of consciousness and intent. My real concern is that our tendency to regulate in the wake of a crisis is a very national tendency to do so, and I think it assumes that if the United States can get its own regulatory regimes in order, somehow we'll inoculate ourselves against these kinds of instabilities. In my view, will simply accelerate this already pronounced tendency of the locus of global economic activity to go elsewhere. But I don't have a solution to this because there's no global regime. There's a lot of national regimes that try to coordinate, and I think there's actually some aspects of what's going on in these internal discussions amongst the so-called G20 that have the potential to be quite productive. Because I think there's a recognition that any solitary national action, including solitary national action on the part of what still is the largest component of this global system, the United States, is likely to not work, because it's a little like capturing lightning in a bottle or attempting to grasp quicksilver. And I fear that America is still in the mindset of, because we're large and because we set so many of the rules for so long, that if we just get it right, get our derivatives regime down, have a clearinghouse, these issues are somehow going to be contained, when the net result is likely they're simply going to go elsewhere. Now Jack mentioned some of these, how do you deal with the different regimes about transparency and coordination, and I think some of that probably will go on. But discussion and transparency is not the same as requirements. It's more WTO-like. You create a framework, and you have voluntary participation. I think the point that Raymond made about the absence of global institutions is the most crucial factor, and I frankly don't see a way around that until those institutions evolve, if they even evolve at all.
Jump in, if I may.
Yeah, perhaps we could take a few questions, and the panelists could roll in some of their responses to Zachary.
I really want to respond
okay,
to.
after Jack's response.
There is stuff going on here that is not rocket science that we really have to focus on. We have global institutions, but they are, in my view, not unlike what we discussed last night, a kind of magic show in which people's attention becomes diverted from the reality. So we have the Bank for International Settlements. We've had the Global Financial Stability Forum, now to be followed by another global entity, all of which have been designed to paper over what's really going on in the international banking system. What happens is that this whole business, and this goes back to my philosophical point, has been captured by people who tell us that there's an inevitable system here that is beyond political control, beyond political reach, and therefore we really can't do anything about it. It's like lightning in a bottle. And therefore politics is disabled, and what are we to do? Give up. Well, That is not the answer. It cannot be the answer, because all that will happen is we get ready for the next bigger, more awful collapse. I have been looking at this for a long time. The business of allowing U.S. institutions to create U.S. dollars outside of the reach of the Federal Reserve Board, outside of the reach of the U.S. Treasury Department, and lend them to any fool who wants to borrow them at any price. And then when a bank like UBS goes under, we then give the Swiss dollars so that they can cover what UBS blew. Phenomenal.
I see head movement in both directions, so I really want to open up the floor. We're going to take the student question up here in the orange shirt first, in the orange shirt, and then we'll move back to the woman who just reached for the mic, please.
So I've been sort of thinking about this throughout all the panels yesterday and sort of especially this morning. And I think the current crisis has sort of highlighted for me how much I think economic power has sort of supplanted political power, especially in the last sort of 20 to 30 years, but I mean especially also in the last decade. And how, perhaps this is facilitated by the sort of shadow financial system. But at the end, sort of political power still has to be invested by some kind of constituency, whereas economic power is much less accountable. And so does this, do you think this changes the nature of the problems that the world, or at least the Western world, is experiencing? And does this then change the nature of the solutions that are necessary to sort of attain stability and sort of are political institutions then still sort of an efficacious, are they efficacious for dealing with these kind of problems?
Let's take several questions and then open it up to the entire panel. The woman in the black shirt.
In New York, that would be everybody.
That's everybody, and I live in New York. So, exchange controls. I mean, is it inevitable that capital flows freely, or is that is Bob Rubin and Larry Summers going around the world getting everybody except maybe Malaysia to give up exchange controls? Is that, can we reinstitute that? Is it inevitable that capital just gets to go wherever it wants? And is it inevitable that it gets to go wherever it wants anonymously? I mean, why does the United States accept anonymous capital, and you're allowed to have an anonymous partnership in Delaware, things like that? So I guess, just the whole hot money issue, and what can we, do about that, national governments?
Let's bring it over to Alex in the shirt and tie on halfway here.
Thank you. These are three quick questions for Professor Reddy, which in fact feed into the questions that have already been asked. Professor Reddy, and this is an outgrowth of what we were talking about offline, isn't it true that one of the reasons, or the main reason why these financial assets that are now being held by the banks can't be valued is that the models that were used to construct them were not used to construct them in a way that would enable one to assign a value, but were rather marketing tools. That is to say, were tools primarily there in order to convince the buyers or the greater fools to purchase them. That's question number one. Question number two, is it not true that the reason why these models were put to that purpose is that there was a tremendous need for, quote, so-called safe dollar assets? That is to say, assets that were viewed to be as safe as treasuries, but were not treasuries. Question number two. Question number three, is it not true that if the other two questions are true, that in a kind of fiat monetary regime, the desire for a fiat currency could become so huge, so large, and of such importance to an economy that you begin to see these sorts of financial transactions taking place which economically make no economic sense, but appear to make some sort of ideological sense? Those are my questions.
Let's take these questions. I'll just go right down the panel, maybe a minute or two brief responses, and then we'll see where we are for time.
I'm going to vary from the questions if I can, and make a much broader comment about what the effect of this crisis is having around the world. There's a tension between democracy and capitalism. Democracy seeks to spread the rule of law. Capitalism is increasingly operating outside the rule of law. And this tension between these two, in my judgment, will be a very significant factor playing through the 21st century, likely to be a defining issue. And the field upon which this will play out is the issue of global income inequality. The shadow financial system that I've been talking about is basically the movement of money from poor to rich. That is its purpose, is to shift money from poor to rich. That's what it accomplishes. This is having the effect of not only hurting the capitalist system, but at the same time hurting the spread of democracy. What I would like you students in particular to keep your eyes on is this tension between democracy and capitalism, and how that needs to draw closer together with capitalism making the movement toward greater justice, rather than democracy making the movement toward lack of transparency.
I'd like to answer the questions in order. First, I think the question you raised about economics and politics is precisely my point. Politics is really the beginning of everything. It's not something subservient to economics. You would not have currency without a government that can stand behind the currency. This entire game wouldn't work unless there were licensed banks, federal guarantees, a Federal Reserve Board. Get it out of your head that economics operate in a world completely apart from politics. Doesn't happen. So don't talk about it that way. You've got it backwards. Secondly, on the question of hot money, can it be contained? Well, I'm going to go back to the mythology. We have a group of accountants and an accounting standards board that nobody pays attention to that has enabled the creation of entities that nobody knows about, nobody can control, yet in fact, this is something subject to political control and public debate. It's just that nobody knows enough. We've established a group of magicians who can play this game. I would argue that you tell the U.S. major banks and brokerages, you may not have a subsidiary in any place that has no serious financial regulation, period, full stop. You can't do business in those places, period, full stop. This is called government control and regulation. As long as we simply say, well, of course the Cayman Islands have a $7 billion or $1 trillion banking center, that's okay, that's garbage. And we have to understand that and say no to it. And then finally, the greater fool model and the idea that this is all a product of economics. I met the guy at Merrill Lynch who started inventing derivatives and marketing them precisely because nobody knew what their value was. Now, the problem in all brokerage, and it has been the problem ever since that brokerage business opened up, was if you're trading stock, the cost of trading stock has gone to damn near zero, at least as functionally close to zero as it can get, because everybody has access to the same tools, the same trade at the same minute. So you need a product that nobody can understand where you can build in a markup. And the only way to get that is to have a unique product that really is ununderstandable. And if you can peddle that to a sucker, you're in the game, and you've made a pile of money. And that's what they did. They did it calculated. They did it deliberately. And when the House Banking Committee, and again, I worked with a staff at the time, when the House Banking Committee began to question this insanity, the economists poured in to justify it. And it was the bankers who then rolled into Washington to shut up the people on the banking committee who were saying, you people are crazy. You have disconnected money and instruments from reality. You can't do this. No, 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 said the bankers. We have the economic theory that says this is all going to work. Now, you want economic theory run amok? Take a look at the geniuses who explained that when communism collapsed, we had to go to a free market. What did we get? Albania, an absolute Ponzi scheme, investment in nothing but air, blue sky and air. That's what happens when you have no controls, when there aren't supervising adults, and somebody's figured out how to skim the fools.
By the way, I realized when I was talking before, I was getting Jack and Raymond mixed up, but I was looking at them correctly. Look, on what's both been said before, I fundamentally disagree. I don't think it's a matter of selling a bill of goods. I think the reality is that we could regulate all that we want and do a very good job isolating ourselves from some of those particular issues that have afflicted the American system, afflicted the European system, but that a lot of those activities, whether it's shadow banking, whether it's derivatives, whether it's financial innovation, would simply go elsewhere in the world. They would go to China, or they'd go to India, or they'd go to Brazil, which are much more regulated in their own way, but also, oddly enough, much more non-transparent, corrupt. That there is a global movement, not necessarily of capital, but just of people desiring more stuff. To the question about does capital have to be free? No, it doesn't. But having created both technological and kind of literal systems that are difficult to they're easy for any particular country to contain. They're almost impossible to contain at a global level. Having detached from any national system, which is what's gone on in the past 20 years, I just don't believe that's a genie you can put back in the bottle. And because there's so many parts of the world now that, contrary to the intent, I wouldn't argue that the intent of a lot of these systems is to transfer as much wealth as possible to as few people as possible. The reality is far more people globally are becoming more prosperous than not. I think if you argue that point, there is no material way to argue that point. Whether it's hundreds of millions of people in China, hundreds of millions of people in India, hundreds of millions of people elsewhere in the world, sub-Saharan Africa being a complete exception to that statement currently, that there is vast amounts of wealth creation from poverty in what we call the developing world, and vast amounts of decreasing affluence, or certainly plateauing affluence, in the developed world, some of which goes into the pockets of a very limited number of people, some of whom believe that they are playing the world for greater fools, and hence the derivative trade. Although some of the same things we say about derivatives today, apropos your point, are things that people said about going from barter to gold, gold to silver, silver to paper. If you read any of the debates in the United States and Europe at the turn of the 19th century about value being detached from anything real, about dollars having absolutely no substance, about this being the end of any kind of true connection between one's labor and the value of what one produces. That's where the whole debates around communism and capitalism emerge. This is part of what happens in technological periods where people invent new ways of transacting goods and ideas. And I think in the greater scheme of things, that's one of the moments that we're in, which is certainly moments that come with a great deal of venality, corruption, people trying to play each other for greater fools, but that the bigger picture is we create new systems of value and commerce. That's what human beings do and have done for a long time and are likely to continue to do. Period.
Okay, let me take the two last questions. First, Lee Shepard's question on whether free capital mobility is inevitable and what is the role for exchange controls. I think one might make a distinction between the idea that the exchange rate, which is a price, should be determined by the free play of supply and demand, by the free market at each and every moment in time, and the idea that there should be free mobility of capital over borders in the sense that it should not be impeded. And of course, one can also make a distinction between the idea that there should be free mobility of capital across borders and the idea that all capital should be allowed to move freely across borders, which is the distinction that was emphasized earlier by Raymond. Now, since these things can be unpacked, we can think about different ways of organizing the world financial system, which perhaps permits some of them and not others. As you know, in the Bretton Woods system, it was conceived that exchange rates would be fixed. John Maynard Keynes imagined that there would not be entirely free capital mobility as a general rule, and that capital mobility would, capital flows would primarily have the role of helping to provide for trade payments rather than international investment. He did not conceive of a highly globalized world of substantial international investment across borders. Now, even if we do have such a world, and increasingly we do have such a world, there is still the possibility that we could imagine that exchange rates are much more moderated with respect to the fluctuations that are permitted, or that the kinds of flows that are permitted are much more regulated as Raymond wants. It's worth remembering, I think, that before the Bretton Woods system collapsed, many people thought it would be just inconceivable to have a world in which the exchange rate fluctuated from moment to moment. For us, today, it is straightforward to accept this. We are happy to see graphs in which the pound US dollar exchange rate fluctuates from minute to minute in intraday trading, or second to second for that matter, or microsecond to microsecond. But when the Bretton Woods system collapsed, it was widely thought that it would be impossible for trade to continue and for investment to continue because business people would not be able to form reliable expectations about the future. That was the worry. And when it collapsed, people learned quickly that it would be possible to live in such a system. And various financial instruments, various forms of financial innovation helped with that. But it was also simply a matter of changing one's frame of reference and one's ideas. So I think that's very, very valuable to recognize, to see that what we think of as being absolutely necessary or immovable often turns out not to be the case. Now, I'm not going to advocate specifically for exchange controls in specific circumstances, but I think what one can argue is that there is room for greater diversity in the methods which are employed in dealing with exchange rate management and capital flow management generally across countries than is generally believed. Again, to go back to an episode of free market fundamentalism, which is now embarrassing to contemplate, and those who are involved in it totally disavow and try to sweep under the carpet. Until the late 1990s, the IMF was advocating heavily, with the support of the US Treasury, of course, in the background, for the promotion of free capital mobility to be made part of its mandate, to be introduced into its Articles of Agreement. And ironically, it was at the Hong Kong meeting, 1997 Hong Kong meeting, if I recall correctly, of the so-called Development Committee of Finance Ministers overseeing the World Bank and IMF, that this proposition was supposed to be put forward formally. And needless to say, when the Asian economic crisis hit in that year, it was unceremoniously dropped from the program and never spoken of again, at least not yet. So there are fashions in economic ideas, and there's a lot of selective amnesia. And I think that type of free market fundamentalism, which is so intolerant of reasonable pluralism, a philosophical idea I will draw on here, reasonable pluralism in the space of economic concepts and policies, is in nobody's interest. Well, it's in some person's interest at some points in time, but it's generally not in the public interest.
I think that's actually good food for thought to end on.
I do have to answer the other question. I'd like to answer the other question if there's a chance, but if there isn't, that's all right.
We've run deeply into our break.
Okay, so in answer to Alex's question, I'll try to be brief, and so I won't answer all three parts, Alex. Maybe we can take it up in conversation. I agree with you completely about the thrust of your remarks and the details of your remarks. I think that they're very sound. I think that largely people were not worried about valuing these assets according to accounting principles because there was a market price when they were traded, whether they were over the counter or not. So they didn't have to worry about it. And people were willing to buy them, and not just because they were fools, it's important to underline, and that's not my position, but because there were reasonable arguments that these were valuable assets to hold, that they were risk-reducing, and so on. Those reasonable arguments, of course, had to contend with other potential concerns which were not on the table and were not adequately foreseen. The problem was in this bubble, as in many others, or in this financial crisis as in many others, that there was an ambiguity as to what reason could support, and what was fundamentally the product of market psychology, or what was rather the product of market psychology and of the willingness of others to trade in particular assets. And it's that ambiguity which really gives fuel to manias, crashes, and panics.
We can and will debate these issues all day. I don't think we're going to come to a conclusion on this panel, but please join me in thanking our panelists for a very engaging discussion. And real quickly, I apologize for failing as a timekeeper and running into your break, but we are going to try to start the next session on time, so please take a very brief coffee and bathroom break and be back here at 11:30.